The first sound that broke the morning silence wasn't a speech, a drum, or a politician's voice. It was the sharp, metallic whistle of a factory line starting up for the first time in 17 long years. Workers, some with gray hair, some too young to remember the last time this place was alive, stood still for a moment just listening. Then the cheering began. It wasn't wild. It wasn't noisy. It was the kind of deep, grateful applause that comes from people who thought they would never witness this day again. Across the courtyard, elderly women whispered prayers. Young men filmed with trembling hands. Families held their children up so they could see the machines turning again, as if witnessing history unfold in real time. On this dusty morning under a hot Sahel sun, a factory wasn't just reopening, an entire nation felt like it was breathing again. For almost 2 decades, this enormous facility stood silent. A giant with a cracked spine, abandoned after political pressure, foreign interference, and years of broken promises. The building became a symbol of something people didn't like to talk about: dependence, disappointment, and the kind of economic wounds that no government report can ever fully explain. But today was different. Today, thousands gathered not to mourn what had been lost, but to celebrate what had been rebuilt by their own hands, on their own soil, with their own courage. And that raises a question many around the world, especially here in the United States, are quietly asking: how did a country long pushed aside, underestimated, and pressured by foreign powers manage to revive an entire industry with no loans, no debt, and no foreign ownership? And more importantly, why does this single factory reopening send shockwaves across Africa and beyond? If you've ever wondered what real economic independence looks like, not in theory but in practice, stay with us. This is one of those rare stories where a factory becomes a flag, where production becomes pride, and where people reclaim what they once thought was lost forever. Please keep watching if you believe that truth and sovereignty matter more than headlines. Long before the officials arrived, before the cameras found their angles and the anthem filled the air, there was a crowd, ordinary people waiting silently at the gates. Some had walked for miles. Others carried small stools or plastic water bottles, preparing for a long day under the sun. A few elderly men leaned on canes, refusing to miss what they called the return of our heartbeat. And every once in a while, a factory horn would test its signal, startling the children and sending a ripple of excitement across the field. It felt like the land itself was warming up for something monumental. Then the motorcade approached. The atmosphere shifted instantly. People straightened their clothes. Young volunteers raised flags. Women ululated a high trembling sound that echoed across the courtyard. Soldiers took their positions, and the master of ceremonies, standing in front of a microphone decorated with dust and sunlight, began to call out titles one after another, each announcement layering more weight on the moment. He welcomed the president, the prime minister, the constitutional council, diplomats, ministers, regional leaders, even the commanders of the paramilitary and religious authorities. But the line that made the crowd lean closer was simple and quiet. The people now have their own beer. The people have found their taste. It wasn't about a drink. It was about ownership, something deeper, older, and long denied. Moments later, the local representative stepped forward. He wasn't a man who spoke like politicians. He spoke like someone addressing neighbors, not cameras. With a trembling voice, he told the president that the entire commune felt honored and proud to host a project that had returned from the dead. He thanked the government for bringing infrastructure to their forgotten communities. But most of all, he promised loyalty not to a leader, but to a vision of a country that could once again stand on its own feet. Behind him, people nodded. Some whispered, "Amen." It was the kind of speech that doesn't impress international analysts, but moves the people who actually live the consequences. Then came the central moment of the ceremony, the formal address from the Minister of Industry, Commerce, and Handicrafts. He paused for a long second before speaking, as if measuring the gravity of the day. And when he finally began, his words held the weight of 17 silent years. He reminded everyone that the factory standing before them was not a new building, it was a resurrection. Founded in 2004, shut down in 2008, purchased by the government in 2012 for more than 40 billion CFA, and then left to decay because of multinationals and imperialist interests, as he bluntly put it. The machinery had rusted, the walls had cracked, hope had dried up like a river in the dry season. But then he revealed the turning point, a single order from the president in early 2024. What seemed impossible must be made possible, and quickly. From that moment, everything changed. Contracts were signed. Engineers flew between China and Burkina Faso. Construction crews worked day and night. The pace became so intense that locals began calling the site the factory that refuses to sleep. Within 20 months, an almost unbelievable time frame for such a massive structure, the impossible became real. New equipment worth 9 billion CFA, infrastructure rebuilt with 8.9 billion CFA, production capacity exceeding 600,000 hectoliters per year, and most importantly, no foreign loans, no external debt, no silent shareholders pulling strings from distant capitals. When the minister paused to breathe, the crowd applauded not politely, but with the fierce relief of people who had waited too long to see something built for them by them. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, the minister warned that this wasn't just an industrial project. It was proof, living proof, that a nation could pick up what others tried to bury and bring it back to life. A lesson written in steel, sweat, and sovereignty. A sudden quiet fell over the courtyard, the kind that spreads without being announced. Even the children stopped shifting in their seats. The crowd sensed something important was coming, something not written on the program. And then from the edge of the stage, a single voice rose, a voice rough, emotional, and unmistakably familiar to many in the audience. It was the voice of a national slammer, a man known for speaking the words people are afraid to say aloud. He didn't start with a greeting. He started with grief. Il est mort. C'est fini, he said softly. He is dead. It is over. Gasps moved through the front rows. Elders exchanged uneasy looks. Younger listeners leaned in, unsure if they had heard correctly. His tone didn't match the celebratory atmosphere. It felt almost like a funeral, but that was the point. He began to paint a picture of a symbol that had been destroyed, mocked, judged, tortured, and finally buried. He spoke of forces that wanted not only to kill a factory, but to bury every dream it once represented. His voice trembled with anger not at individuals, but at the idea that an entire people could be silenced by stripping away the institutions that gave them dignity. Then the shift happened, subtle at first, then explosive. Mais ça, c'est mal connaître le Burkinabé, he declared. But that is to misunderstand the Burkinabé. People in the audience sat up straighter. Some clenched their fists. Women nodded with a determined rhythm. It was as if the entire courtyard inhaled at once. His voice grew stronger, fuller. He spoke of one man stepping forward and changing everything. He didn't name him. He didn't have to. The crowd knew exactly who he meant. And when he said il n'est pas mort, même si c'était le cas, the audience erupted in applause. Children clapped without understanding fully. Older men wiped tears quietly. It wasn't about a person. It was about the idea that what once died could live again. Then he turned toward the factory building itself. Brafasso dort, he declared. We will give it a second life. It was the kind of metaphor that doesn't just decorate a speech, it restructures the entire meaning of a national project. He described the 17 years of silence as a coma. He described the reopening as a resurrection, and he described the thousands of jobs returning as spirits rising from the ground. Every sentence tightened the atmosphere until the entire crowd felt like they were witnessing something sacred rather than industrial. His tone sharpened as he spoke to the invisible enemies he believed had tried to bury the factory, le néocolonialisme, les impérialistes, les petits servants locaux. He did not soften the language. He did not dilute the accusation. For many in the audience, it was the first time they heard someone articulate so openly what they had whispered for years. The catharsis was immediate. He presented Brafasso as a frontline in a larger battle, not a battle fought with weapons, but with pride industry and self-determination. The best way to submit a people, he said, is to destroy their symbols. But this time the people had fought back. And they had won. Then came the line that sent the crowd into thunderous applause. Si notre choix de consommer endogène te gêne, c'est que tu étais toi-même le problème. If our choice to consume our own products bothers you, then you were the problem. It was a declaration, a challenge, and an invitation all at once. He mocked those who called national projects propaganda. Vive la propaganda, he shouted, if it creates jobs for our youth. People laughed, cried, shouted, clapped. It no longer felt like a ceremony. It felt like a rallying point in the national consciousness. By the time he finished with Brafasso appartient au peuple, tant que le peuple vit Brafasso ne mourra jamais. The crowd was on its feet, and in that moment the factory behind him didn't seem like a building. It felt like a living body standing back up after years on the ground. The first sign of what this reopening meant did not come from politicians, it came from the people standing behind the barriers. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, a young woman pressed her hands against the newly painted wall of the factory, as if touching something sacred. "My father worked here before it died," she whispered to a journalist nearby. "Today, it feels like he's come home." Her words captured the emotional terrain more accurately than any official announcement. For thousands of families, Brafasso is not simply a workplace, it is a lifeline. The reopening means hundreds of direct jobs from technicians to machine operators and thousands of indirect opportunities for transporters, farmers, suppliers, and vendors. These are not hypothetical projections, they are real positions that began opening even before the doors were officially unlocked. Local farmers, many of whom had been selling raw products at unstable prices, now have a stable buyer for cereals, sugars, and other inputs. For the first time in years, they can imagine a future where their children do not have to leave the countryside in search of survival. Some older farmers said they felt seen again, a sentiment that carries enormous emotional weight in a region accustomed to economic abandonment. And for the youth so often described as frustrated, unemployed, and restless, the factory stands like a promise carved out of steel. The sense of dignity that comes from producing something for one's own nation is immeasurable. Young men were overheard telling each other, half joking, half serious, "If they keep building like this, we will have no reason to leave." There are moments in national life when a government project shifts from being just an infrastructure plan to becoming a psychological turning point. This was one of those moments. People who had lost faith in public institutions after years of crisis insecurity and economic stagnation now saw a concrete example of something that worked. The factory became a visible symbol of a state that does not merely make promises, but fulfills them. Elderly men sitting under a neem tree near the gate debated politics with newfound optimism. Women carrying their market baskets paused to admire the new logo painted on the wall. Even school children lingered outside the fence, staring through the bars as if looking at the future. When people begin to believe again, social cohesion strengthens. Communities that once felt ignored suddenly feel included. A government long judged by its handling of conflict now finds additional ground to stand on economic achievement. Politically, the reopening of Brafasso carries profound implications. It reinforces the image of a leadership capable of delivering tangible results in a short time frame. The narrative of resurrection has become more than metaphor. It has become a political force. This achievement now stands as a counter-argument against domestic critics who accuse the government of focusing too heavily on security while neglecting the economy. It also challenges external observers who portray the administration as isolated or ideologically rigid. Instead, it showcases a government with a clear strategic direction, sovereignty, production, and independence. Public perception is powerful. When people see buildings rise, machines move, and jobs appear, they begin to associate stability with the current leadership. And in a transitioning nation, stability is political gold. Beyond national politics, neighboring countries in the Sahel, many facing similar economic and structural challenges, are watching closely. In Mali, Niger, and other states undergoing transitions, discussions have already begun about replicating the model local industries revived without foreign debt, without external ownership, and with fast-track timelines. For these nations, the message is clear. If one country can resurrect a dying industry under enormous pressure, others can too. When news of the factory's reopening reached Western media rooms, the initial reactions weren't loud, they were cautious. In Washington, a retired U.S. diplomat interviewed on public radio paused for a long moment before offering his assessment. "You don't see many countries doing this anymore," he said. "Rebuilding industry with no foreign loans? That's unusual, and unusual always has consequences." His tone wasn't critical. It was reflective, almost admiring, but with the quiet concern of someone who has watched global economics for decades. Among American analysts studying African development, the reopening of a factory like Brafasso is something of a paradox. On one hand, it is celebrated as a success of national self-reliance, a concept that older Americans remember from their own history, Roosevelt's New Deal factories, Midwest mills, the great age of domestic production. On the other hand, the political framing of the project centered around sovereignty, rejecting multinational pressure, and confronting imperialism creates a narrative that Washington is not accustomed to hearing from smaller nations. A senior economist at a U.S. think tank put it plainly during a panel discussion in New York. Whether we like the tone or not, what Burkina Faso just did is economically impressive. Some American veterans who once worked in African peacekeeping missions have expressed an unexpected sentiment: online pride. They say they remember communities that felt hopeless and abandoned, and seeing a factory rise not built with Western grants but by local hands is to them a sign of dignity. These reactions may not dominate national headlines, but they reflect how deeply this story resonates with Americans who value resilience and hard work. In Europe, however, the reaction has been more tense. Several beverage companies that once controlled West African markets now face the possibility of losing customers to locally made alternatives. Some European commentators subtly labeled the inauguration as state-driven propaganda, a phrase quickly picked up by certain newspapers. But even these critics could not ignore one uncomfortable fact: the funding was 100% local. Behind closed doors, some European business analysts worry that if Burkina Faso succeeds, other African nations may follow the same path, reviving closed industries, cutting dependency, and keeping profits within their borders. For corporations accustomed to operating with little local competition, this is a disruptive shift. Across Africa, the reaction has been dramatically different. Regional Africa news networks describe the reopening as a lesson in courage. In Mali and Niger, commentators praised it as an example of what national unity can achieve. In Ghana, Tanzania, and even South Africa, public debates erupted about whether similar dormant factories should be revived. On social media, young Africans shared clips of the ceremony with captions like, "Industrialization is not dead. Build it ourselves. This is the Africa we want." For many on the continent, the event wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It challenged a long-standing belief that local industry cannot survive without outside control, and it elevated the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, positioning Burkina Faso as a country willing to chart its own path. From Asia, particularly China and India, analysts noted the speed of construction and interpreted it as part of a broader shift: African governments choosing partners based on capability rather than political alignment. This added yet another layer to the global implications: Africa asserting its agency in choosing how, when, and with whom it builds. As the sun began to set over the courtyard, the glow on the factory walls looked almost symbolic, golden, warm, and strangely peaceful. The crowds had thinned, the officials had departed, and the echo of speeches no longer filled the air. But something lingered, something deeper than applause or ceremony. It was the quiet realization that this reopening was not an ending. It was the beginning of a test, one that would determine far more than whether a factory can produce beer. Because every victory carries a warning. History has shown time and time again that whenever a small nation dares to stand independently, daring to produce, daring to compete, daring to dream, pressure follows. Economic pressure, political pressure, and sometimes even unseen forms of sabotage. Burkina Faso's decision to rebuild Brafasso without foreign ownership places it on a narrow road, one that leads either to long-term strength or to confrontation with forces that prefer an Africa that buys but does not build. The question now is whether the momentum can be sustained. Factories are not merely walls and machines. They are promises, and promises require protection through management transparency and the unglamorous discipline of daily work. If this project succeeds, it could inspire a wave of industrial revival across the continent. If it fails, critics will use it as proof that Africa should never try to break the old economic patterns. But standing in that courtyard, watching workers lock the gates with a sense of ownership shining in their eyes, it was hard not to feel hope. Hope that this time something truly different has begun. Hope that the determination of the people will be stronger than the expectations of outsiders. Hope that local pride can survive global pressure. Across Africa, news platforms, observers are already debating what this means for the region. Analysts point to the boldness of President Ibrahim Traoré, to the unexpected industrial awakening in Burkina Faso, and to the possibility that this one factory could become a spark for something larger, a rethinking of sovereignty, development, and dignity across the continent. And that leads us to an essential question for you, especially if you've watched Africa evolve over decades. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's push for economic independence is enough to protect Burkina Faso from external pressure? Or do you think the country will need even stronger leadership, perhaps even a successor who continues his path? Your perspective matters because stories like this rarely make global headlines, but they define the future of nations. If this moment speaks to you, please share this video so more people understand what sovereignty truly looks like, and subscribe if you believe that truth, dignity, and independence must always come before the headlines.